Hi, everyone. Thank you to Phil and Hein Runer for having us here and to talk about what we mean when we talk about food security and how that's related to an ecosystem approach. So first, I didn't recognize everybody that was here or that was on the invitation list, so I thought we needed to maybe explain who we are. So I'm the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Advisor for the Inuit Circumpolar Council. The Inuit Circumpolar Council was started in 1977 by Eben Hobson Sr. from Barrow, Alaska, with the idea that Inuit needed to come together to address common concerns with a common voice. So today we represent 165,000 Inuit across Chukotka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. So we work on various different international forums. The majority of our work is international. And that is kind of supported because we have consultative 2 status at the United Nations, and we're also one of 6 permanent participants at the Arctic Council. So we saw some slides earlier today that showed the structure of the Arctic Council, but just to tell you a little bit about the permanent participants, there were 3 permanent participants that were established long before the Arctic Council, and that was the Sami Council, Raipan, who represents, I think, 57 Russian indigenous groups, and then the Inuit Circumpolar Council. When the Arctic Council was established, they created 3 more groups, the Gwich'in Council, the Athabascan Council, and the Aleut International Association in order to cover additional people. The thing about permanent participants within the Arctic Council is that they need to work at every single level. So our leadership is at the minister meeting, the senior Arctic official meeting, and then we cover all of the 6 working groups. And so the work we share with you today is also the message that we take into the Arctic Council through those 6 working groups and through the different levels of the Arctic Council. So we work on various different topics. For ICC, we really work on topics that are of concern at our villages to our regional level, and this is all accumulated when our leadership from all 4 countries comes together every 4 years to discuss what our priorities are going to be. And then there's a little bit of a different structure within each office. So like I said, ICC has been there from the very beginning, and Mary Simon from Canada was a Nook who was our president at the time and instrumental in forming the Arctic Council, and was actually the first chair of the Arctic Council from 96 to 98. So through those forums that we talked about, these are the different topics that we tend to concentrate on because, well, at least for the last 8 years, this is what Inuit from across those 4 countries have been telling us we need to pay attention to. And food security has remained at the top of that list for the last 8 years. But it was actually there even long before that. We just started calling it food security about that time. So we have to think about, I'll just jump back to an ecosystem approach for a second, and indigenous knowledge. So we understand our indigenous knowledge to be a systematic way of knowing that holds methodologies, evaluation, and validation processes, and inherent within that indigenous knowledge is an ecosystem approach. It's inherent within the way that we monitor, the questions that we ask about the environment around us, and how we manage our behavior within that environment. So this is also what we mean when, I'm sure all of you have heard us say continuously, the need to take a holistic approach. This is what we're talking about. But this is also what we're talking about when we're pushing for people to apply a food security lens. And that's something that the Arctic Council has heard us talk a lot about for the last 4 years. And that's what I would like to share a little bit more about today, of what it is we mean when we say a food security lens or food security. So like I said, food security is a top priority for all 4 countries, but the stuff I share today was developed from Inuit in this country. So it's really based off of what they're saying. So probably about 6 years ago, our leadership was talking about food security, primarily at the Arctic Council, and saying we need to apply this food security lens. We really need to address food security. And what they heard coming back from across the table to them was, great, let's do an analysis on nutrients and calories. Let's look at purchasing power. And those three components are really important, but it wasn't what our leadership was talking about. It's not what Inuit are talking about when they say food security. It's a much more expansive definition than that. And that's what spearheaded this work that we did through the 4 regions in Alaska. I should say quickly, in Alaska, we don't use the term Inuit so much. We use the term Eskimo. But shortly after ICC started, we made a compromise to say Inuit. Because in Canada and Greenland, they don't like the word Eskimo. But here, the areas that we cover are from Kaktovik down to Platinum. So this is Inupiat, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, Central Yupik, and Chupik peoples. But still today, I'm going to say Inuit. So through this project, the people through those 4 regions came together to define what our food security is, to identify the drivers of food security and insecurity, and to create a conceptual framework that lays out all of the pieces needed in order to understand how to assess food security. So I'll quickly just say there's 57 drivers for food security and insecurity. This is reflective of the holistic view that we are seeing in this to be in this environment. So this is how we begin to lay out what our knowledge is, how we see the world. And this is how we see the world. This is our ecosystem, but not the puzzle. So you see our ecosystem has everything within it, right? And it's not just marine. It becomes really tricky when we're always asked to say, we're just talking about coastal, just talking about terrestrial, just talking about marine, because nothing stays in those areas. Nothing that happens in those areas are going to stay in that area. So for example, caribou rely very heavily on sea ice for walking across areas, and even for refuge. Beluga don't stay in the ocean. They go up rivers to shed skin during certain times. They spend quite a bit of time up rivers. So we can't say they're just marine animals. And it starts again to see how are we looking at all of this as a whole. So this is our ecosystem. And then before we get to the definition of food security, one way that is really helpful to understand is how an elder explained. An elder from Tuxuk Bay explained what the Arctic is and what food security is. He said the entire thing is this puzzle. And what happens is that we need all these pieces to make up that puzzle. So within this puzzle, we have sharing, we have feast, we have hunting, we have animals eating and oceanography, benthic species. It's all those pieces together, and there's other pieces nested within those pieces. The problem for us is that people are coming and looking at one of those pieces and then making policy recommendations or making decisions about what's happening in the Arctic. These pieces are always adjusting, and they need to always adjust. Between these pieces are what Inuit pay really close attention to when we're monitoring the environment. And in order to understand food security, in order to understand the Arctic, we need all of these pieces. We have to look at all of these pieces. For scientists, this is helpful to understand. You can think of each of these puzzle pieces as a system. You can think of this as system science. You can recognize that culture is a system that's going to interlink with oceanography. So, as I said, we have a definition for Inuit food security now. And I have the executive summary for those of you that would like to take a closer look at it, or you can also find the reports on the ICC webpage. But the part that I wanted to stress here is that in the very first sentence of this definition, it says that Alaskan Inuit food security is the natural right of all Inuit to be part of the ecosystem. This is key and instrumental to how we're viewing this environment, because we are part of the ecosystem. This isn't an anthropological kind of perspective, because there's not a hierarchy involved there. It's not what the environment is doing for us, it's we're part of that environment. The next thing we did, or as I mentioned, we have 57 drivers. Those 57 drivers is what helped us create a conceptual framework that lays out what our food security is. So this is our drum. The drum is really important for Inuit, and so that's why it's shaped that way. And I'll just break this down very quickly and then explain how that's related to an ecosystem approach. In the center here, we have food security, and surrounding food security is what it's characterized by. So food security is characterized by environmental health. So we're talking about the entire environment when we say food security. When we say we need to assess food security, we're saying we need to assess that entire environment. Surrounding that are these 6 dimensions that are needed in order to have a healthy environment. It's availability, Inuit culture, decision-making power and management, health and wellness, stability, and accessibility. I won't go through how we define each of those terms, but just like the term food security, we can't assume what is being meant by these different terms. For example, oftentimes when you look at health and wellness literature, it's focused on humans. For us, we're talking about everything, the water, the animals. Even when we're talking about mental health, we're not just talking about human mental health. The mental health of the animals is just as equally as important for us. Surrounding that are the tools that we need in order to keep stability within those dimensions, or those 6 dimensions. And something that the advisory committee has asked me to always share is the importance of those 6 dimensions interlinking and maintaining cohesion with each other. If any piece starts to come out, then we won't have food security. And that's why those tools are needed. And those tools are knowledge source. As we heard here, it's very nice to hear so much here today about the importance of using both indigenous knowledge and science. And that's what that's focused on. We need policy to support that, or to support these dimensions, and we also need true co-management. Now, because we're Inuit, there is a spiritual component to our knowledge system. And the truth is, there probably is to every knowledge system. So surrounding the outside of this drum is like sinew. And this is, these are 4 words in each of those 4 languages of those 4 groups of people that make up the Inuit in Alaska. And it means the spirit of all. The handle is holding the drum up in its food sovereignty. And this also is true for every culture and every country, that without food sovereignty, you won't have food security. So we see that this goes well beyond nutrients and calories and caloric intake. But how does it apply to an ecosystem approach, or how we see the entire environment together? So this was also something that was created through this project with these concept maps to help us explain what we mean to take those pieces of that drum and to look at all of them together. We wouldn't normally put a walrus in the center here. You could put ice in the center, benthic species in the center. You could put anything in the center. This is just to help us be able to tell this story. So you can see here with these 6 dimensions, you can start to see how all of these things are interconnected. And as a matter of fact, if you talk to a walrus hunter, they will never only talk to you about walrus. It is always going to be about sea ice and benthic species and currents and timing and gas and all of these pieces that have to be considered, even when you're just considering the health of the walrus. But we also have to consider the cultural elements for it. So when you live in a walrus community, when you're very young, you start being taken out to learn how to be within your environment, to learn how to have a relationship with walrus, to learn how to respect that environment. And after so long, once the people in the boat have determined that you have enough knowledge, then you're allowed to take that walrus. When you take a walrus, or any food, the first thing you have to do is give to your elder. And that act is the transition from being provided for to becoming a provider. And this is everything that defines self-identity for Inuit. This is everything that makes up mental health and physical health. So all of these pieces are connected. So when we look at the walrus health, we also have to consider that boy's health and everything in between that. This also demonstrates how we're looking, or what it is we're looking at in these environments. For indigenous knowledge, it's very much focused on the relationship between components. Its monitoring is very much focused on the relationship between those components. So the relationship between the benthic species and the walrus, or the relationship between the sea ice thickness and the walrus. or the relationship between that young boy's identity and sea ice thickness. Those are the pieces that we're monitoring, and which is why it is so important to have both knowledge systems at play there, because we're asking different questions. For us, this is an ecosystem approach. This is what it means to apply a food security lens. This is another example that really starts to more illustrate the policy part of it and some of the changes that are occurring because of climate change. Many of you might have heard already that because of change in snow cover, change in precipitation, there's a change in berries that are coming. So last year they came way too early. They didn't ripen very well in most areas. This year they came really early again, and it's mostly blueberries everywhere. There's not very much of the other berries in a lot of places. Well, people are having to drive further distances to get to the berries, and but there's other pieces to that also. It's why is there a change in the berries, and who is it that's going to be asked to change their behavior once we determine what that change is? We know that change is due to change in, as I said, snow coverage and precipitation. But who's asked to change their behavior? Oftentimes, if we look at things like fish or even walrus, it comes down to the hunters or the subsistence users are first asked to change their behavior. So we really have to pay close attention to that governance structure also when we're talking about an ecosystem approach to management, because these management decisions or structures have to be extremely flexible and adaptable in order to allow for the people on the ground to continue to adapt also. So I think the main message here is that to have a food security lens, the importance of having a food security lens is because it allows for us to see the entire picture or the entire puzzle. And remember, we can't look at the puzzle from just one piece or two pieces. And we need that to understand the Arctic. But very importantly, we also need that to understand what the cumulative impacts are. We can't really get to the point of managing things if we don't understand what the cumulative impacts are going to be. And looking at the relationships between these components can help us understand those cumulative impacts. So, actually, that's everything done. So, Koniakpa.